I never dreamed of being a poet for a long time. I didn't dream at all, because when you're a migrant working on a construction site, breathing dust and concrete, living in a room with 8 other women, waking up every morning at 5 to the sound of the horn, you don't think in rhyme. You think, make it through, survive, don't drop the slab, don't meet the foreman's eyes, don't miss the bus. But the words still lived inside me, like water between stones, like light through cracks, like breath when you're convinced you no longer exist. I didn't write for fame or for likes. I wrote to not disappear, to keep something of mine amid the hammering drills, the clang of shovels, the weight of sacks, something that wasn't measured in shifts, hours, penalties, or number of bricks. I wrote my first poem on the back of a rent invoice. I was sitting on a concrete step during lunch, a piece of bread in one hand, a pen in the other. I wrote small, almost invisibly, because if they saw it, they'd laugh. What, you think you're an actress now? Girl, you can barely speak Russian. Poetry? Really? But the words came anyway. My name, a forgotten noise, my body, invisible labor. But inside, I'm still the same, alive. And maybe my lines don't lie. I read it back and hid the page in my hard hat. After that, I wrote on anything I could find. Scraps of instruction manuals, ramen wrappers, even cement sacks. I hid them under my mattress in a boot inside a thermos. Sometimes I lost them. Sometimes I was afraid they'd be found, but I kept writing. It was my breathing. Each word, like a nail pinning me to reality, so I wouldn't dissolve into the dust. I shared a room with women who had their own stories. Some had fled war, some hunger, some husbands who thought fists were arguments. We didn't share details. But one night, when one of us, Zara, was crying into her pillow, I approached her. I didn't ask anything, just pulled one of the pages from my helmet and read, softly, in a whisper, without emphasis, like a prayer. She didn't say anything, just nodded. And the next day, she asked, "Can you read me another one? Something about how to keep going, even when you're too tired." That was the first time I thought, maybe my poems aren't just for me. But that was before. Before the day one of my poems flew off in the wind from the second floor. I had been cleaning windows. It was spring, sunshine, dust. And suddenly, the page lifted from my palm and fluttered away. I ran after it, but it vanished past the fence. My heart was pounding. It was one of my most personal pieces about my mother, about being an orphan, about how at 10 I whispered into my pillow, "Don't forget that you're alive." I panicked. It felt like someone would see my soul naked. A week later, a stranger showed up at the site, in a coat, holding a camera, a journalist. "Who writes poetry here?" I froze. No one knew. Only Zara, and she'd kept it quiet. The others hadn't read anything. He held my page, flattened but intact. I found this in a park nearby. At first, I thought it was a quote. Then I realized it's alive, raw, precise. Do you know who wrote it? I looked at him, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Me. He didn't look surprised, didn't question it. Just said, "Then we're doing an interview." I laughed, for the first time in days. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. You're not just a poet. You're a voice. And it's time people heard it." I didn't know then where it would all lead. I just returned to my room, sat down, and wrote, "You won't see me on your screens. My face masked in dust and sweat. But in these lines, no fog, no dreams, just life that hasn't left me yet. I never truly belonged anywhere. In the dorm, I was too quiet. On the construction site, too fragile. At the market, too honest. On the bus, must be a nanny or a cleaner. On the street, must be someone's wife, otherwise what's she doing here?" No one ever asked me my name. They asked, "Looking for a gig? Know how to clean windows? We need a loader. Got documents? You speak Russian, okay?" I did speak, but softly, because I knew if you speak loudly, you're either fighting or demanding. And I wasn't fighting, I was surviving, which is a very different way of existing. On the construction site, I became part of the background. I was the one who carries the cable, The girl in the gray hoodie, the one who cleans up fast. No one knew that at night I wrote lines about the sky between cranes, that I remembered the bitter soap smell from the orphanage, that I had a scar on my rib, not from injury but from silence, the kind where no one notices you're hurting. The foreman knew me as the quiet one. He'd sometimes joke in front of the others. I wish women were more like her. No extra words, just gets the job done. Everyone laughed, and I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I knew my silence wasn't from fear. It was from depth, and one day it would speak. Women on site had two options: become tough, swearing, smoking, hardened, or become invisible, obedient, quiet, no demands. I chose the second, not out of cowardice, but because it was the only way I could stay myself. But inside, I boiled. I watched the same hands lay tile and ball into fists, the same eyes laugh and judge. The women working beside me would say, "We don't complain here. We stay silent." And I stayed silent too. But I had poetry. And there, I said everything. No one took me seriously. But they did take me for temp jobs. Still, I laid down words, like bricks, one after another, carefully, and each poem, not a scream, but a whisper for those too scared to speak, but who live, who see, who feel more deeply than the loudest hands ever could. One day, during a smoke break, a young guy named Dan saw me scribbling on a scrap of paper. He walked over, surprised. "What are you doing?" "Writing rhymes." "Number just poems." He whistled. "Can I read one?" I froze, then handed him one of the simpler ones. No metaphors. Just about work, cement, about a woman standing in dust, listening to the crane hum overhead. He read it, silently, then said, "It's like you described me, not head on, but from the inside." And then I knew, words can come from me, but strike right into someone else's heart. And if that happens even once, then my life is not in vain. The journalist who'd found my poem in the park sent me a letter through the foreman. It was brief. "We published your piece, then two more. Now we want to create a collection. With your story, you're not just a writer, you're a window into a world people usually don't talk about." I read it 3 times, then sat down on the concrete where they'd just laid tiles and cried, not because I was scared, but because for the first time I felt it. I'd been heard. Me, the one they used to hire just for temp work. Now, they take me for my words. She walked into the editorial office wearing a gray jacket, a worn-out backpack slung over her shoulder. At the front desk, a pause. The secretary glanced up, sighed. "Who are you here to see?" Aaliyah pulled out a letter, held it out. "Your journalist, Alexei Kot. He found my poem, said it would be published." The secretary looked again, at her face, at her hands, at her shoes. "Take a seat, I'll check." The wait dragged on. The chair's leather was stiff, the air dry. People passed by, glancing sideways. No one smiled. Finally, a door opened. "Come on, they're expecting you." A room with floor-to-ceiling windows, tea in packets, one laptop, 2 editors. That same journalist, Alexei, in the corner, coffee in hand. "Aaliyah, right?" A dry male voice. "Yes. We read your poems, especially the one about your mother, the construction site, the notebook with rusted edges. Strong text, very real." A pause. Then the second editor, a woman in glasses with a "we're professionals" expression, added, "But there's a catch." "What kind?" Softly. "It's too honest, too raw, too unpolished. And the reader, you understand? They want to be inspired, not dragged into the darkness." Aaliyah looked at them, silent, listening. "We'd prefer something lighter," they went on. "Maybe write about dreams, about how everything will be okay, about hope." "Hope is my poetry," she said, her voice steady, emotionless, like steel. "You're just not used to hearing it from someone who smells like concrete." A pause. Alexei set down his coffee. "Wait a minute," he turned to the editors. We didn't invite her for fantasy, we invited her for truth. Truth is heavy, which is exactly why it needs to be printed. That day, there was no publication. They asked for time to think. Aaliyah walked out to the street. At the bus stop, wind stirred old flyers. She took out her notebook from her backpack and wrote on her knee, they say, "Write about the light, but we have no window. We work in darkness." And each poem is a lamp. Not because it's beautiful, but because otherwise you can't see where to go. 2 days later, Alexei called her himself. "I gave your poems to an independent outlet. Unfiltered, they'll publish them. With your name, your story, and your photo, right there in a hard hat." "Thank you," was all she said. "No, Aaliyah," he replied. "We should be thanking you. You showed us what a real voice sounds like. No PR, no posing, no editors." That evening, with the drill roaring again at the construction site, one of the new guys said, "Hey, are you really in the paper now?" She nodded. "I am." "So what, you famous or something?" Aaliyah adjusted her sleeves, held her helmet in both hands, smiled. "Number just now, silence is no longer my weapon. Now my weapon is the word." 3 days after the publication, the first letters came in. Her email, which she rarely used, lit up unusually bright. Subject: "Your words made me cry." Subject: "Thank you for writing this." Subject: "I wear a hard hat too. It's not so scary now." Aaliyah didn't know how to respond to everything. She just read, slowly, one by one, holding her breath. Sometimes, with a lump in her throat, women wrote from all over, from Dnipro, from Gomel, from Berlin, from Istanbul, migrant workers, laborers, teachers, young mothers. I used to scribble secretly on the backs of receipts. I was in an orphanage too, now I'm a paramedic, but I'm still afraid to raise my hand in meetings. When you wrote, they didn't give me a key, so I carved one out of words. I broke down sobbing. In the editorial office that first rejected her, a new article appeared. No formal apology, but the headline read, "Poetry Without Polish, the construction site voice that touched the country." Aaliyah stared at the screen, not believing it. That's me? She, the one who used to hide her poems in a thermos, was now being quoted in educational newsletters. One of her verses was read aloud on the morning radio. Her roommate, Mariana, watched it all with disbelief. "So now they're calling you a poet? That's what they say. But the shower schedule's still the same, huh?" How else would it be? At the construction site, things got quieter. Not literally, but in the way people addressed her. Some started saying hello. The foreman stopped calling her, "Hey." One of the younger guys offered her a packet of cookies during lunch. Respect. Another wasn't so kind. "So what, now you write from above, huh? Like you're better than us?" "I write about myself. Feels like you're the only one being real, and we're just silent nobodies, right?" She didn't reply, turned around, walked away. That night she wrote, "I don't speak for everyone. I speak from myself. If you heard it, that means it lives in you too. If it hurt, then we're not so different. If you're scared, know this. Someone has already walked the same slabs before you." Later that evening, a telegram message came through. Journalist Alexei, "You're being invited to speak at the Voices of a New Generation Forum." "What is that?" "A conference, lectures, panel discussions." "I'm not a lecturer." "You're a voice." Aaliyah went, packed her bag, wore the same sweater she'd been wearing since winter, brought 3 poems with her, and a sheet with the questions they'd sent ahead of time. On stage, lights, microphone, camera. In the audience, hundreds, maybe thousands. Some in suits, some with tablets. And her in dusty work boots. In her voice, uncertainty, but in her eyes, truth. "I didn't come to teach. I came just to say that even in the hardest conditions, you can still hold on to yourself. If you don't abandon your voice, even if it's a whisper, even if it's in a hard hat, even if no one ever asked your name." Silence in the hall, then applause, not thunderous, but real, like it wasn't just the audience reacting, but something inside them remembering. That night on the subway ride home, a woman sat across from her, stared for a while, then asked, Excuse me, are you the one who wrote, I'm silent, but my hands are screaming? Aaliyah nodded. The woman leaned in. You wrote about me, even though you don't know me? Aaliyah smiled. Maybe I am you, just from a different shift. Applause doesn't keep you warm. It rings out, loud, powerful. But when you come back to an 8-bedroom and lay your head on a pillow stuffed with synthetic filling, you don't hear ovations. You hear the creak of the bunk next to you and the hiss of the pipe under the window. After the forum, life seemed to split. Before, work gloves, trash, concrete, the shuttle bus. After, stages, interviews, short trips. Journalists called her a new social voice. Forum organizers said she was the one who speaks for the unheard. On the Women of the Year website, her photo appeared in the People's Choice section, and at night, everything was as before. Aaliyah, did you wash your dishes? Aaliyah, who's next for the shower? Aaliyah, are you on the morning shift or the afternoon? Her roommates looked at her differently, some with pride, others with tension. One day, Lena, the oldest, asked bluntly, So, what are you now, a star? Aaliyah put down her book. Number, I'm still the same. Right, the same, just getting published in magazines while we're still hauling bags. The bags didn't disappear for me, I just have words now. And I don't want to hide them anymore. They sat in silence, sipping tea. Then Lena said suddenly, You know, when you read your poems, I feel a little less ashamed of myself. You may not notice, but we feel like someone speaks the way we do. And in this world, believe me, that's already a luxury. Aaliyah was on the construction site less and less, but she never left it. Her shifts alternated with trips, job sites, with lecture halls, work gloves, with a microphone. One day the foreman said, Honestly, I thought you were quiet and weird, and look at you now. So now you're like a poet with a bag of cement, huh? He laughed, not unkindly. Aaliyah nodded. I didn't choose to be a poet, I chose not to disappear. One Friday, she returned late after a reading at a small library. There were 20 people there. One man left in tears. A girl came up and hugged her, saying nothing. And at the dorm, a broken light bulb, the smell of food, the TV blaring, someone shouting, Shut up already! From the far end of the hall. Aaliyah sat on her bed, opened her notebook, and wrote, I have a stage, but no room. I have words, but no silence. I have a voice, but it only echoes when no one else is around. The next morning, she got a call from the Ministry of Culture. We want to include you in our Voices of the Vulnerable program. Publications, appearances, travel, maybe even a book. But for that, you'll need to leave your job completely and relocate to the capital. Aaliyah went quiet. The voice on the line added, It's a big opportunity. We want to help you grow. She looked out the window at the construction site beyond, at Liza, her roommate, fussing with plastic dishes, at the traces of dust on the floor, at her boots, and said, I'll think about it. But growing doesn't always mean leaving. Sometimes it means staying, right where you're still needed. She printed the offer letter, taped it above her bed, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the road to the top doesn't always lead upward. Sometimes it leads deeper, into people, into truth, into yourself. She didn't choose the path of the stage. She chose the path of being heard. It's not the same. The stage gives you height, the microphone, volume. But to be heard is when someone stops mid-stride, turns their head, and hears themselves in your words. At first, she read for one woman on a bench near a grocery store, then for 3 girls in a dorm room, then for a whole courtyard where people sat on stools, steps, windowsills. She didn't need permission. She needed air, so that breath could reach every line, so that her voice didn't echo in speakers, but went straight into a person. She didn't memorize poems. She didn't hide them in her phone. She knew by heart everything she wrote. Because it wasn't poetry. It was her rewritten biography, her breathing, her way of not dying. When cultural centers began to invite her, she wasn't surprised, but she refused large halls, podium chairs, bouquets. Once she was offered a reading in a trendy art space with vinyl playing, projections on the walls, and champagne in the guests' glasses. She said, "If I read there about the girl who was beaten in a migrant camp, will they applaud or look away?" They said the atmosphere was part of the art. She replied, "My atmosphere is pavement with the imprint of a hand that hasn't held anything warm in a long time." And she didn't go. She stayed on the street, stood by an abandoned fountain holding an old notebook. People approached slowly, as if afraid to disturb her. One guy in a gray hoodie came closest, stared at the ground, then said, "I've been listening to you for 3 days. I've never found myself anywhere. But, in your words, it's like I'm inside." She nodded and said, "You are inside. Of my words, my pain, my path." And he cried because no one had ever said that to him, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. Every day there were more people. Someone brought tea in a thermos. Someone brought stools. Someone just stood silently. Sometimes she read by the library, sometimes in the park, sometimes right in front of a school where they asked her to lower her voice because children were in class. She spoke softly, but she was still heard, because truth doesn't need volume, truth needs precision, and she had the precision of pain, the kind you don't learn, you live through it. At one reading, a man came with a camera. He was from TV, though he didn't say so. Filmed from the side, didn't come close. Later, he posted the video online with the caption, "A woman from the construction site who now speaks to the streets." The next day, 100,000 views. 3 days later, 500,000. People started asking who she was, why she wasn't in auditoriums, why she had no contracts, why she wasn't on TV, and then they answered themselves. Because she wasn't the format, because she was too real, and that was her superpower. A week later, a cultural center called, offered her a hall for 100 people. Alia agreed, but with one condition: no tickets, no registration, no guest list. If someone wants to come, let them. And they came. An hour before the start, people were already lining up, some with kids, some with notebooks, some with trembling hands. Half an hour later, not a single free seat. People sat on stairs, stood against walls, leaned on doors. One man stayed outside, listening through a cracked door. Alia came out in her usual clothes, the same sweater, the same boots she wore on the scaffolding. In her hands, her notebook. Her face, calm. Her voice, quiet. And the room held its breath. She didn't greet, didn't thank. She simply began to read. "I never learned to speak beautifully. I learned to stay silent without losing my mind. I don't know how stories end when childhood never held a single, 'I'll be waiting for you.' But I do know a word can become a ladder that climbs you out of the very bottom, not out of poverty, out of invisibility." When she finished, you could hear someone crying, softly, soundlessly, and it was louder than all the applause in the world. It was an ordinary morning, dusty, damp, just like all the others in the neighborhood where time had stopped. First, the kitchen faucet dripped. Then someone loudly searched for a charger. In the far corner of the dorm, someone was arguing on the phone. Alia, as usual, got up early, made tea in the same enamel mug, checked her work gloves, her notebook, and the route for the day. She had another trip, not to a construction site, but to a youth center, where she had promised to read a few poems to teenagers, the kind who hurt but don't yet know that it's okay. While checking her email, slowly, cup in hand, still in slippers, hair wrapped up, she saw a message. The sender, an unfamiliar address. The subject line, in English. At first she thought it was spam or a mistake. She opened it and froze. Geneva, United Nations Human Rights Council. She read it twice, then aloud, then just sat down on the bed. The message was brief. "We listened to your performance translated by one of our staff. We believe you are an important voice in the modern conversation about human dignity. You are not a politician, not an activist, which is exactly why you are true. We would like to invite you to speak during an open UN session in Geneva, dedicated to voices from the invisible parts of the world. We will cover your flight and accommodations. We ask only that you read what you've already written, or what has yet to be born. You don't have to be a hero. You already are a testimony. She read it again. Her fingers trembled. She didn't feel elation. She felt something deeper, quieter, as if someone had finally noticed, not her volume, not a headline, not an image, but her essence, the part she was once afraid to show when she used to hide her poems inside a hard hat. The next morning she stood in the kitchen and tried to say it aloud. "I've been invited to Geneva." Mariana scoffed. "Geneva who?" "Not Geneva, Geneva, the city. The UN." Pause. Then the kettle hissed, and Lena, without looking up, said, "Well, damn, and here you are, still washing dishes with us." "Because I do. And I will," Alia replied, "even if I speak at the UN. Because a person doesn't change because of a stage. They change when they forget where they came from." She didn't want special preparation. No stylists, no interviews, no promo videos. She asked only one thing. "Can I stay myself?" And they said, "That's exactly why we invited you." The flight was the first in her life. She flew in jeans and the same sweater she wore when reading in public squares, hair in a bun. On her lap, her battered notebook with a bent corner. Inside, 20 lines written half asleep. She knew these were the ones she would read. The hotel was warm, the room bright. They gave her a badge, a pass. A thin folder with the program. Everyone spoke English, some French. She was accompanied by a translator named Ava, the very woman who had found her video and reached out to the UN herself. I just couldn't not try. I watched and cried. Because it was the first time I'd heard what silence really sounds like. I wanted them to hear it here, too. Alia nodded. "I'm not loud, I just don't want to be a shadow anymore." The hall was huge, high ceilings, a podium, glass booths for interpreters, people in suits, nameplates of countries, cameras, microphones, and her in the same sweater, with the same voice, with the same truth. She was introduced briefly. Alia Dusa, migrant worker, poet, a person who gave herself the right to be heard. She approached the microphone, took a breath, and began to read. "I'm not a citizen of the great world. I'm a passerby between borders. I've received no summons, no awards. I simply stood in the shadow of your faces. But every step I take is my right to walk. Not fast, not to the center, not upward, but toward the place where silence stops being a prison, where a word becomes a home." When she finished, there was silence. No ovation, no flashes, no shouts, just silence. Deep, real, the kind where everyone heard what they never dared name. And then one woman, representative of a major European country, stood and said, "Thank you for reminding us that behind our decisions are always people like you. We speak of rights, but you live without them. And yet you've done the most important thing. You gave yourself a voice, and in doing so, gave it back to thousands." Alia bowed, not like a performer, but like someone who had spent a lifetime in silence and was finally heard. The plane landed at night. She rode through the sleepy city in a taxi, a neatly folded badge reading United Nations in her backpack, and hundreds of unread messages, invitations, and congratulations on her phone. Alia was silent, staring out the window. All that glamour, those photos by the flags, the filming, it all felt like it had passed right through her and stayed behind. She hadn't brought home a triumph. She brought home a feeling, I can speak, and no one can take that away anymore. The taxi stopped at the familiar entrance, peeling stairs, dim light above the door, someone smoking by the wall. Inside, the smell of food, a blaring TV, someone's sleepy cough. The dorm, that same one. Lena opened the door. "So, UN girl, you're back?" Alia smirked. "I'm back. And honestly, I never really left. Everything really was the same. Same room, same bed. The cracked mirror, the kettle with lime scale, damp towels draped over chair backs. But something inside her had changed, not louder, not higher, just calmer, deeper, wider, like the ground had grown under her feet, something she could now stand on, even if the world around her was still full of wind and dirt. At the construction site, the welcome was reserved. Some nodded, others joked. So, what now? Gonna mix cement like a star? Alia took off her coat, put on her gloves. Have I ever mixed it any other way? During lunch, one of the new guys, a short 20-year-old, came up to her. Was that you reading in Geneva? I saw it on the news. My mom watched too, she cried. She worked her whole life in textiles. Said it's like you voiced her thoughts out loud. Alia smiled. I'm not anyone's thoughts. I just stopped hiding my own. That evening, she read poems again. Not in a hall, not on camera, in the dorm courtyard, an old stool, a notebook in her hands. Around her, the same people she had mopped floors with, carried planks with, shared food with, and everyone listened, quietly, for the first time, not with irony, not just to be polite, but for real. I didn't go for glory, I went for proof that a word, even the softest, can become light if it's no longer hidden. When she finished, no one clapped, but no one left either. People sat, stood, stayed silent, as if something inside each of them, some folded up corner, had finally unfurled, and that meant more than any ovation. A few days later, her neighbor from the floor approached her, a sweet, quiet woman Alia had barely spoken to. Listen, my daughter writes poems, but she's shy, thinks it's nonsense. Would it be okay if she showed you something? Alia nodded. Of course, just tell her not to be afraid. I started with a scrap of paper, too, and the fear that everyone would laugh at me. And now the whole world listens to you. Number, Alia looked out the window. Now I listen to myself, and that matters more. She began holding readings again, in courtyards, libraries, youth centers. Schools started inviting her, not as a guest, but as an example, not a role model, not a star, but a living story of how you can find your voice even in a place where all your life they told you. Be quiet. She didn't move to the capital. She didn't sign with the publishing house that asked her to polish the language and tone down the poverty. She stayed here, between wet pavement and pipelines, between the sound of minibus horns and the voices of women still afraid to ask for silence, because here, in this unkempt, dusty, forgotten corner of the city, she was needed, not as a poet, but as proof that you can be invisible and still become a voice, that you can be poor and still speak richly, that you can be a woman and still belong, even in the most unwelcoming world. She never dreamed of being a mentor. She didn't like the word teacher. It felt too official, too lofty, as if it demanded standing on a pedestal and waving a pointer. Alia didn't like heights. Her whole life had been built on flat ground, concrete, ladders, dust, cracks, where the seeds of her words hid. But people began to come. First there was that girl, the neighbor's daughter, the one who was ashamed of her poems. She came in the evening with a sheet of paper written in a trembling hand, the ink barely visible. Alia read it silently. Then she said, This is strong, just don't hide it, please. Let it breathe. Even if no one claps. The girl cried. It was the first time someone had told her that what she had inside wasn't a mistake. It was something real. Then more came. A young guy from the next district who wrote rap but didn't believe his lyrics mattered. A woman in her 40s. A former librarian from Donetsk who started writing short stories during evacuation but thought, it's all too naive. A boy from an orphanage, silent, angular, but with eyes that held a storm. Alia didn't put up announcements. She didn't open a school. She simply left the door ajar, and people came because they felt, here you can speak. No one will make you be loud, proper, educated. Here, it's enough to be alive. They came on Saturday evenings, to a small room in the district library, or to a bench in an abandoned park, or just to the stairwell of the dorm. Each brought a paper, a notebook, a phone, sometimes only silence. And Alia would say, that's a form of speech too. Even if you're only silent now, you've already begun to speak. One day, a journalist wrote again, Woo, we want to make a documentary about you, not just an interview, but with the people who listen to you, the ones you've helped. Alia thought for a moment, then replied, Don't film me. Film them. I'm not the story. I'm the start. All that's needed is to show how one voice can give birth to others. 2 months later, at a regional contemporary word festival, several people from her circle performed on an open stage. No fear, no filters. One read about life in an orphanage, one about domestic violence, but without loud words, just about a plate that shattered in her mind every day. A third about carrying the shadow of a father and learning not to repeat it. After the performance, audience members came up to them and said, "It felt like it was about me. Thank you for saying what I was too scared to even think. Where did you learn to write like this?" And they replied, "From a woman who once read poems by a fence." Alia kept living the same way, same boots, same bus stop, same discounted groceries. But now, as she walked down the street, she heard, "That's her." And then, "She's real." And that's when she understood the strongest thing is to be yourself so honestly that it becomes easier for others to be themselves. She didn't give advice. She didn't host workshops. She didn't explain how to rhyme properly. She just said, "Write like you breathe, not like they expect, not like it's trendy, not like school taught you, but how it's born inside you when you're no longer afraid." At the end of summer, a young man approached her, around 22, in a plain sweater, but with eyes of someone who's been walking on the edge for a long time. "I thought if I started writing, people would think I'm weak." "And did you write?" He handed her his phone. She read. It wasn't perfect, but it hurt. It was real. So real it tightened her chest. "This isn't weakness. This is strength," Alia said. "Because you told yourself, 'I exist.'" He looked at her for a long time, then whispered, "You saved my voice, maybe even my life." That evening, alone, she pulled out her notebook, opened to a blank page, and wrote, "I never meant to lead. I just walked. But if someone walks beside me, let them know. Here, you can be silent. Here, you don't have to know. Here, you can be real. And if one day you whisper, then one day you'll be heard." It was a regular stage at a local cultural center. Wooden floors, plastic chairs, a microphone that buzzed slightly when moved. On the wall hung a banner that read, "Voices from the Margins." Aaliyah sat backstage, holding her old notebook, the same one that still held her first poems, written between shifts, between fears, between the words, "You don't belong here." The organizers had offered a fancy chair, lemon water, and a flashy introduction, but she asked simply, "Just leave the stage, plain lighting." And silence. Let the words do the rest. There were many unfamiliar faces in the audience, but also some she recognized immediately. The foreman from the construction site, the same one who once sneered, "A poet in concrete." A pair of young workers she'd seen before, now in clean shirts, clearly invited by someone. One of them caught her eye and quickly looked away. In the front row sat a woman from the district administration. Her face showed polite respect, but her eyes held a different curiosity, because the story of how Aliyah made it to the UN had spread. But the fact that she returned, that was what people really wanted to understand. She stepped out, no introductions, no applause, and began to read. They laughed when I was silent, called me strange. Then they laughed when I whispered, called me weak. Then they stopped laughing. Because someone listened, because someone cried, because a word spoken from pain doesn't reach the ears, but the deepest part inside, and never leaves. She read slowly, never raising her voice, yet with every word the room grew quieter. Someone folded their hands in their lap. Someone froze, afraid to move. One of the construction workers looked straight at her, not defiantly, as if he was seeing her for the first time. And then she saw, he recognized her, the same woman he once sent to the storage room so she wouldn't get in the way. Now he listened, back straight, face still, as if everything he'd once said came back to him, and quieted, because she no longer needed to prove anything. She was already louder than any argument. She ended the performance with a poem she had never read before, written the night before when the lights went out in the dormitory and she sat by the window with a phone flashlight. "I don't want to be a symbol. I want to be a bridge. one that carries those who go unheard. And one day, they will become a voice themselves, not for glory, but so silence is never again a synonym for fear. When she fell silent, no one clapped at first. The quiet was so thick it seemed like everyone could breathe easier and harder all at once. Then someone stood, then another, then the entire hall rose, not like at a show, but like a human thank you. And among those standing was him, the former foreman. Now there was no hierarchy, no shame, no status. There was only this. He now stood and listened to the woman he once refused to let speak. Later, backstage, a girl approached her, very young with a backpack and a notebook. I can't write like you, but after your reading, for the first time, I want to try. Aaliyah took her hand. Don't write like me, write like you, because truth only sounds real in your own voice. That evening, she returned to the dormitory, the same noise, the same food smells, damp towels, laundry detergent. But now, someone had carefully taped a note to her door. You gave me back my voice. No signature, no fanfare, just someone's truth. Just as quiet as everything she had once begun with. Aaliyah smiled, sat on her bed, opened her notebook, and wrote, When I was gone, I was still here. In my words, in my steps, in my silence. Now I'm here, and I don't need to be anyone else to be heard.